think we will start. And I'd like to welcome all of you. For those of you who are not experienced Zoom users, if you wish to see closed captions, there is a button to click on at the bottom of the screen. If you would prefer to see the captions in a separate window, I think Lauren is putting a URL into the chat that you can click on to get the URL for the captions. Please also click on mute so that we don't hear background noises such as sirens and dogs barking in your house or apartment. So I think they posted that we are recording this. When the recording is ready, we will post a YouTube link on the website for others who missed it tonight. So I would like to start the meeting by thanking Chen for his generosity in establishing an annual $5,000 scholarship for a high school senior with hearing loss who is committed to giving back to the hearing loss community. Al will introduce the first annual award winner of this, Nicole Varghese, who will then give a short talk about her thoughts about improving accessibility. Al?
Thank you, John. I appreciate you having me here. And I want to thank everybody for being here and for, especially the scholarship committee, for working so hard to make this scholarship come true. I wanted to give back to the hearing loss community, and I've also wanted to inspire the younger generations to hopefully think about giving back sometime in the future as well. The hearing loss community is growing, so their input and their thoughts and their insights will be an important part of improving accessibility for everyone in the hearing loss community. And I also wanted to personally congratulate Nicole Varghese on winning the scholarship, and wanted to introduce everyone to the winner of the scholarship, the first inaugural winner of the scholarship, Nicole Varghese.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So I hope that everyone enjoyed Memorial Day weekend and is having a great evening. My name is Nicole Varghese, and I'm honored to be the first ever recipient of the scholarship award. I have moderate to moderately severe hearing loss, and so I wear hearing aids, and I have my teacher wearing hearing assistive technology, which connects to my hearing aid. It's been so hard this whole quarantine season, especially with online learning for me, to hear clearly, and I can imagine similar struggles for many of you during quarantine. I understand your struggles, and even though it has been frustrating at times with not being able to speech read due to math, for example, it has made me more resilient.
Nicole, can I just interrupt for a second? Can you just slow down a little bit?
Yeah, of course.
Many of us don't hear as quickly as you can speak or think.
All right. I have always believed that if you're passionate about something, that it's easy to express your views on it. And that has been exactly my experience with writing the essay that won me the scholarship. In order to increase accessibility for people of the hard of hearing and deaf community, it's integral for us to be educated on the biological roots of our hearing loss so that we could educate others. I will never forget the day when I was taught how to analyze my audiogram for the first time, and I was able to understand my hearing loss. When I became more informed, I was able to share my knowledge and experiences with others and create a more supportive and empathetic environment. Self-advocacy is also an important concept that we have to master. I have learned how important it is to speak up for myself and always get what is necessary for me to grow and be successful. In order to be a strong self-advocate, one has to be confident and determined to go up to someone else to establish what they need to do to help you out by getting them aware of your hearing loss and its implications. This includes asking for accommodation. Self-advocacy is an essential tool that we need, which empowers us to seek improved accessibility in all areas of our lives. I also mentioned in my essay about my formal business plan that I worked on in my entrepreneurship class called Shakti, which translates to strength in my mother tongue. This business produces hearing aid jewelry. I want my customers to combat the notion that hearing aid or cochlear implants should be covered up and rather incorporate it as a part of their style. My purpose is to enhance self-expression for people who wear hearing aids or cochlear implants. this business venture could help people in the community to embrace their hearing loss and hopefully change negative perceptions of hearing loss and deafness. When I was younger, I would actually use my hair to cover up my hearing aids because I was embarrassed of how my hearing aids were a necessity to me. And it still makes me very emotional to this day. But now I have been transformed into someone who is empowered by speaking about my hearing loss and sharing my experiences with others. I want everyone in the hard of hearing and deaf community to realize that they should never be underestimated because of their disability by themselves or others, or let it define who they are. Rather, our experiences as members of the community should empower us and ignite a fire in us that illuminates wherever we go. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Mr. Taylor and Mr. Chen, as well as everyone else on the board of the New York City chapter of the Hearing Loss Association for giving me this opportunity. Finally, I would like to end off with a quote from Neil Marcus. Disability is not a brave struggle or courage in the face of adversity. Disability is an art. It's an ingenious way to live. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicole. There were many deserving applicants for the, I don't know if you can see people are clapping. There were many deserving applicants for this scholarship. I think you can see why we chose Nicole. We chose her because of the thoughtfulness of the essay she submitted, which complemented an extraordinary academic record at the very competitive Staten Island Technical High School. We are confident that she will continue her success in the fall at Hunter College, and we wish her the best and hope she will stay in touch with us. Towards that end, we are giving her a year's membership in HLAA. So thank you, Nicole. Our featured speaker tonight is Rebecca Alexander, author of Not Fade Away, a memoir of senses lost and found. Born with a rare genetic disorder called Usher syndrome type 3, Rebecca has been simultaneously losing her sight and hearing since she was a teenager. She was told that by age 30 she'd be completely blind. Then at 19, 1 year after a fall from a second-story window left her athletic body completely shattered, she discovered she would lose her hearing as well. Despite these difficulties, Rebecca refused to lose her drive and zest for life, and rose above and beyond every challenge she faced to become an award-winning author, a psychotherapist, group fitness instructor, disability advocate, and extreme athlete. She will speak tonight about resilience in the face of adversity. Born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area, she currently lives in New York City. I had the pleasure of hearing Rebecca speak at the National HLAA Convention in Rochester in 2019, and I know that we're all in for a treat. She's an inspiring speaker. If you have a question for Rebecca, please type it in the chat box. At the end of the presentation, I will read aloud as many questions as we have time for. Even if you are not posting questions, you should keep the chat box open to avoid the orange chat icon that pops up and covers the captions. If you prefer not to see the chat, you can drag and drop it to the side of your screen. Okay, Rebecca, it's all yours.
Okay. Congratulations, Nicole. That's so exciting. And Hunter College is such a reputable school. I'm so excited for you. And it's just such an honor. And so it's just wonderful to be here with you tonight as you're receiving this award. I'm excited to see what you end up doing at Hunter. So congratulations. Very exciting. Yeah. Okay, so David, how do we want to do this? Are you going to like share your screen? Ta-da. Okay. So this is sort of the title page, as John mentioned. I believe that was you speaking, John, right? Yes. Okay. So there we are. Okay, so let's go to the second slide. So I have something called Usher syndrome. I just want to say something here. If you need to interrupt me because you need me to slow down or anything, If you need me to stop because we don't have much time left, please, feelings will not be hurt. Anything that you need from me, just let me know. So I have something called Usher syndrome type 3. Usher syndrome is the leading genetic cause of deaf blindness in the US and around the world. We know today of about 1% of what we believe to be 400,000 people affected. We've identified about 1% of that population. So we still have a ways to go in terms of identifying people with Usher syndrome. So a person born with Usher syndrome type 1 is born completely deaf and they're progressively losing their vision. Their vision loss tends to start in their adolescence and teenage years and has a more rapid decline. They generally have balance issues as well. A person with Usher syndrome type 2 has generally, they're born with what we consider to be sort of a set amount of hearing loss, and they're progressively losing their vision. Now, I have found that friends of mine with type 2 Usher syndrome don't generally tend to lose more hearing until a little later in life. And a person with Usher syndrome type 3, what I have experiences the mildest onset of both progressive vision and hearing loss. When I was first officially diagnosed with Usher syndrome type 3 had not yet been identified. It did not yet exist, at least clinically. So it was my own family's blood work and researchers in Helsinki, Finland, who happened to put together this missing link where they were able to identify Usher syndrome type 3. Next slide, please. So here is a picture of me young and before I was really kind of diagnosed with Usher syndrome, and pretty normal. I used to watch television out of the side of my eye, and we always thought that that was just sort of a funny quirk of mine, that for whatever reason I had this habit of watching TV out of the corner of my left eye. Well, it turns out later that we learned that my left ear was my stronger ear, and so I would cock my left ear forward in order to hear the TV better, right? So when I was younger, doctors told my parents that I had a cookie bite of hearing loss. They thought it was associated maybe with ear infections, and there wasn't really any talk of it being anything more than that. And when I was 12, I had difficulty seeing the blackboard at school. And I told my dad, and he took me to an optometrist, and the optometrist said there was something in the back of my eye. Their equipment wasn't sophisticated enough to identify what it was. And so they sent us to a couple of ophthalmologists, and the ophthalmologist confirmed that I had something called retinitis pigmentosa, or RP, and that by the time I was an adult, I would be completely blind. Next slide, please. So I don't know how much well, I'm going to try to keep this tight and concise. But so having this diagnosis with RP at 12, essentially the way that it affected me at the time was that it affected my night vision most. So I had the most difficulty seeing at night. And so if we went to see a movie, I was told that I'd have to grab someone's arm. I oftentimes, that my vision below me was my worst vision. So I would trip over the dogs. But in general, I was pretty much functioning like any other kid, except I was pretty clumsy, or at least so I felt. RP, or retinitis pigmentosa, is the opposite of macular degeneration. Some people are more familiar with macular degeneration, where you lose your central vision and then your periphery. And RP, you lose your periphery and then your central vision. So it becomes known as what is tunnel vision. So my first actual experience with Usher syndrome, with having a disability, was actually when I was 18. I was in a pretty serious accident. I fell out of that window that you're looking at on the right side, that high window, and fell onto that flagstone patio after a night of being out with some friends from high school. We'd just graduated. We'd had too much to drink. Nicole, listen in here. And after having too much to drink after graduation, I landed myself back home, and presumably I was going for my bedroom door to go to the bathroom, but we don't actually really know. There's some thought that maybe my vision had something to do with it. So instead of going for my bedroom door, I went for my bedroom window, and I fell out onto our flagstone patio. I broke just about everything in my body, except I didn't hit my head, and I didn't break my right leg or my right foot, but I broke my back. I shattered my left foot. I shattered part of my left hand. And so it was a long recovery, and it meant being in a wheelchair and having to, I had a lot of bone graft from my hips to various parts of my body to put myself back together again. The man in the middle who you see here, I actually visited a couple of years ago when I was home in Oakland, California, where I'm from. He was the neighbor who found me. And he was a police officer who had just gotten off duty at about 5 a.m. And he happened to hear those very faint, I think, cries for help. And so I went over to his house and I knocked on the door randomly, and I just wanted to thank him. So we took a picture together, and I felt like I should share it here. Next slide, please. So when I graduated from high school, I ended up at the University of Michigan. This woman who you see on the left here, her name is Joni Smith. She was the director of deaf and hard of hearing students at Michigan. She was also their primary interpreter. They had many interpreters, but she was the queen interpreter. She interpreted for Nelson Mandela, for the Dalai Lama, for Bill Clinton, for all of these different world leaders. And she was so humble. I had a lot of encouragement from my family when I was growing up to, do as well as I could. In fact, it's interesting because for me, growing up with hearing loss and vision loss and not quite being as affected as I am now, I think that people missed a lot of signs. And I think that a lot of teachers thought that I was sort of a dreamer, that I had my head in the clouds. And interestingly, my parents were not the ones who doubted me. They were not the ones who made me feel incapable. It was my teachers. It was a lot of teachers who made me feel like I was too needy. For instance, when we would have, what do you call it? Nicole, you would know what this is, when you have assembly. And I would grab onto my teacher because to go into assembly, it would be completely dark. And I think the teacher went and told my parents that I was very needy. And what we didn't know is that I had this vision loss. But so I had all of these sort of messages, again, not from my family, but from different educators. And so when I went to the University of Michigan, Joni was really the first person who taught me how crucial self-advocacy is, the importance of understanding what your rights are, that these are not privileges we're asking for, that they are rights, that to have accommodations made so that you have equal opportunity and access to information is simply a part of what your rights are as a student, as an employee. And so she was really sort of, I would say, a bit of the, no pun intended, or the usher into sort of the deaf community and being someone who was hard of hearing. So I really officially started wearing hearing aids in college. I had them from some years before, but I found that with my hearing loss in certain environments, I picked up too much sound, which I know we've all experienced on this call, right? Where I was hearing the fibers in the carpet, in the rug, or where I was picking up too much background noise and not enough of the sound that I wanted to hear. But I woke up one morning with really loud ringing in my ears, tinnitus. I think many of us, if not all of us, have experienced it on this call, right? And so the sensation was that I could not hear people speak to me over it. And I finally went to an otolaryngologist. This is around the age of 19. And they told me that I don't just have RP, I have something called Usher syndrome, that they'd never seen it as it presented itself in me, but because I had both vision and hearing loss, it could not have been anything else. So with the encouragement of Joni, and my own curiosity. At the University of Michigan, I decided I would start learning sign language. Not because I ever thought I was going to need sign language. I had no idea what my trajectory would look like. It's not like Usher syndrome type 3 even existed yet. I didn't have anyone in my family who was affected. So I didn't know who to turn to or what my vision or hearing would be like over time. But I was very curious about sign language. And so I decided to start learning it at the University of Michigan. And I'm very glad that I did. It sort of helped me bridge this gap of living in this gray area of no longer being fully hearing, but no longer being a deaf person, of being able to sort of find my way in between. And like Nicole, at the University of Michigan, I used to hide my hearing aids under my hair. It was something that I felt a lot of shame around. And I remember going to a class one day. I really was a big football fan, and I had a class with football players, and I had a hat on and my hair was up, and I didn't want my hearing aids to show. And of course, in those days, hearing aids were more like having two boom boxes on the side of your head. They were not quite as sleek and sexy as they make them now. And so I was very self-conscious about it. And I went to class without wearing hearing aids. And I was very lucky that the teacher or the professor didn't call on me, because I didn't hear a thing. And if I'm being honest, I don't know if she called on me. She very well may have. I didn't hear a thing. And so I realized when I left that class that the only person who was really being affected was me, that nobody else in that class was at a disadvantage by me not wearing my hearing aids, that I was the one putting myself at a disadvantage. And so it was a difficult transition for me to sort of accept that this was a part of my life, having not only tinnitus, but the hearing aids. But I did find, as many of us do, that the hearing aids really helped me manage the tinnitus itself. Next slide, please. Okay, so I went home one summer after my junior year at Michigan, and I was struggling. I was trying to figure out how to make sense of the fact that I was given a diagnosis that I was going to be going deaf and blind. Nobody could tell me when. But I found out that through the Department of Rehabilitation, receiving a cane and cane training was a free service. And for whatever reason, I thought getting anything free was cool. But I want to make sure that this is not misunderstood or mistaken for me accepting the fact that I needed to use a cane or would need to use a cane down the road, because I drove to my cane training. So for those of you who have not experienced seeing someone park and get out of their car and unleash their cane, I'm not sure that that it's a sight that I would suggest anybody try doing, but that was where I was at the time. And so I did my cane training, and I went back to the University of Michigan. I graduated and I moved back to California. I was supposed to do a program. I was hoping to do a program in West Africa. And as I was looking into this program through a program called Global Roots, dengue fever broke out, and they said, we're not running the program. And I had to figure out what the heck I was going to do. So I moved to Los Angeles, where my twin brother was going to be starting law school. And it's around daylight savings that people with vision loss often say that they feel like they've lost more vision because it's getting darker earlier. But of course, what we know very well is that whether it's hearing loss, whether it's vision loss, any form of loss is a very emotional experience. We hear about all of the technology and all of the cool, innovative things that are happening, apps that are being developed for people with hearing loss. But we don't hear people talk as much about the emotional experience of living with hearing loss. And so for me, at that time, daylight savings rolled around, and I found myself driving when really it was getting darker. And this was before ride sharing. And I just remember watching the sun set as I was on the freeway trying to get home and thinking to myself that this is not safe, that I really need to find that cane that was somewhere in my junk drawer and give it another whirl. So I went out to the street. When I got home, we lived on a street that was very heavily populated with trees, so it was very dark. And I went out to the sidewalk, and when I crossed the street, there was a car that was waiting for me to pass because, of course, he saw a woman with a blind person's cane and he wanted to make sure I got across the street safely, I think. And it was my first sort of coming out. It was my first announcement to the world that I was blind, that first and foremost, what people would know about me or think about me was all based on how they felt about people with disabilities or people who use a blind person's cane, and I hated it. So I cried my little heart out that night as I went through that experience and realized, I think I got to get out of California. But while I was figuring out what my next move would be, moving out of Los Angeles, where you really needed a car to get around, I decided that I wanted to do something proactive. And remember, in the midst of all of this with my diagnosis, I'm still living with chronic pain from my accident. And I'm still doing as much as I can physically to take care of my body because of the injuries I sustained. So I decided to register for the AIDS Life Cycle Ride, which is a 600-mile ride from San Francisco to Los Angeles. Next slide, please. So I want to give you a sense of what my vision is like now. Now, that is my beautiful mini golden doodle, Olive, also known as Monkey, also known as 16 other nicknames. And I had to get her into this slideshow somehow, so this is my gift to you. I'm using her as an example of a normally sighted person has about 180 degrees of vision. And I have somewhere between about 10 and 12 degrees of my centralmost vision. And this is the best idea that I can give you of what my vision is like. So you can imagine that it requires a lot of scanning for me to sort of pick up what's in my environment, especially in a new environment. So I did this AIDS Life Cycle Ride, and next slide. And as we made our way into Los Angeles, so we were going, you know, the first day was 110 miles. I don't know how I made it out alive, but apparently I did. And one of the last days as we were making our way into Los Angeles, we were riding along the PCH, the Pacific Coast Highway. And there was a part of the ride where there was no bike lane. We had to make this makeshift bike lane. And I just remember that cars were whizzing by me 70, 80 miles an hour. And on the other side of me was just this rickety guardrail. And alongside of that guardrail was this cliff and this spectacular, you know, view of the ocean with crashing waves. And I remember thinking to myself as I'm riding, you know, single file down the Pacific Coast Highway with about 35 more miles to go, that I was really anxious, that I didn't know what kept me from, you know, just veering into traffic or veering over the side of this guardrail. Because whenever we get anxious or overwhelmed, we have a tendency to go down that rabbit hole of the worst case scenario, and then the worst case scenario, and then the worst case scenario, and it's sort of a bottomless pit, right? So in that moment, I came up with a mantra, and it's a mantra that I still use to this day, 20-something years later. And the mantra is, breathe in peace, and I would breathe in through my nose, breathe out fear, and I would breathe out through my mouth. And I did that for the next 30-something miles to keep myself focused on the road, and clearly it worked because I'm presenting in front of all of you today. So that's something that I oftentimes encourage my patients in my psychotherapy practice to do, is to come up with a mantra, particularly at times where they feel like their mind is racing, or when they're really having a difficult time staying present. Next slide, please. So I moved to New York City, and my stepmother, Pauline, is actually from New York. And I'd always been curious about New York. And she said, you know, I think this is going to be the best place for you. I really think that you're going to thrive there. So between my curiosity and her encouragement, I really made the best decision for myself by coming to New York. I didn't have to worry about driving anymore. I was going to be in the same boat as everybody else, taking public transportation or cabs if I needed to. Remember, this is all before ride sharing and Lyft and Uber. So I decided to attend Columbia. I did a dual degree in public health and clinical social work, and I will be paying off those loans until the day I die. And so here I was in New York. Here's a picture of me using my cane. I found that despite all of the craziness and the sort of hectic nature and the chaos of this city, that it was the best place for me to thrive, because as I started developing comfort with using my cane, the first, several times I used my cane in public, I cried. And using a blind person's cane and crying in public, fortunately in New York City, doesn't draw that much attention. So it really was the best place for me to be able to develop comfort with my disability and also maintain my independence. Next slide, please. So before we play this video, I just want to tell you, so I learned sign language at the University of Michigan. And when I graduated from Columbia, I got a job actually at the School for the Deaf in Brooklyn. And so I was a social worker there for maybe 3 years. And afterwards, when I started doing my training at Helen Keller National Center, some of my O&M, orientation and mobility training, I met many people who use tactile sign language. And tactile sign language, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is the beautifully intricate language of the deafblind. Now, all of us have been very seriously affected during COVID because of the masks that people are wearing. But to imagine being someone who relies on tactile sign during COVID, when at best someone can be 6 feet, within 6 feet of you, the deafblind community really, really struggled through COVID, as we all did. But I think that it's important to sort of mention that. But one of the other things that I love about tactile sign language is that we live in a time and place now where we have so many screens in front of us. We have our Apple Watch, we have our iPhone, we have our iPad, and we have our computer, and we've got the TV on in the background, right? So we have all of these screens, we have all of this information being thrown at us. We are constantly multitasking, right? But when you're with someone and you're using tactile sign language, I can't be looking at anything else or focusing on anything else but the person directly in front of me. So David, if you want to hit play.
Yeah, sure. Okay, sure.
So you see that that's a man named Blaze and his fiance, now husband. And I basically asked them, that was sort of mid conversation, whether they were going to be staying the night or whether they were going to be going home, where did they live? And I told him I wanted to take a picture with him. And his fiance said, let's take a picture. So that's what we did. But so what's important, I think, about just sort of seeing this is that I brought my hands to his chest and his hands to my chest. And it's not inappropriate. It's not sexual. It's not by any means, I think, taboo. This is part of how they communicate. And it is such an important part of relating to each other. There's so much in terms of being deafblind where tactile skills are sort of heightened and used unlike anybody else uses their tactile skills. So over the time that I've developed comfort with my own condition of going deaf and blind, and while I've continued to go deaf and blind, my tactile skills have become quite strong. And I say this to you as I am using putty, aromatherapy putty in my hand to keep myself from, well, really picking my nails, but I'm a very tactile person. Next slide, please. So I wanted to try to gather as many of my hearing aids as I could before I went in to get my cochlear implant. So I never knew that I was going to be a candidate for a cochlear implant. I never believed I was going to be a candidate for a cochlear implant. I didn't even realize that I was going to have to wear hearing aids for the rest of my life. But So all of this just sort of came one step at a time. And at some point, I went and got evaluated several times for an implant. And when they told me I was a candidate, I was really going more to prove my, family and friends that I wasn't a candidate, because I had proved to them before that I wasn't. And they said, "Congratulations, Rebecca, you are a candidate for a cochlear implant." So what we learned was that my right ear, which was never my good ear, my right ear was always decorative. It could wear an earring, it could pick up environmental sounds, but it couldn't really discriminate sounds. I never used it for the telephone. Everybody always walked on my left side. My right ear with the hearing aid had 28% discrimination. Without a hearing aid, it had 26% discrimination. So clearly that hearing aid was not doing me much good. And we all know the dreaded sound booth. So you can imagine coming out of that and getting those kind of scores, how that felt. But so I scoured and found as many hearing aids as I could and put them out here. And so this is me showing you as many hearing aids as I could find before I went in for, I don't know if it was I think it was before my right surgery. And this is me obviously cochlear implanted, and I'll come back to sort of the subject of that photo later. But I decided to get cochlear implanted in 2013 on my right side. It's a very personal decision, I know, but HLAA, I think most of us are born and raised as hearing people, and progressively lose our vision or lose our hearing due to any number of different reasons. So for many of us, we are ideal candidates. I was an ideal candidate. I can tell you that it was the hardest work that I've ever put into anything to relearn how to hear. And it's been the most rewarding experience I have had to be able to hear as well as I hear with my cochlear implant. I know that Catherine and I have had a number of conversations about being cochlear implanted. One thing that I sort of liken it to sometimes when I tell people, when they say, well, what's the difference between hearing through hearing aids and hearing through a cochlear implant? And the only way I could ever really describe it is that it feels like the difference between listening to something on Blu-ray and listening to something on a cassette tape. It's so crisp and so clear that there was nothing quite like it. But it was a process of relearning how to hear. Next slide, please. So my best friend, Caroline, wrote a letter to my left ear. My left ear was my second ear to be implanted. It was not a candidate in 2013, but became a candidate in 2017. And so she wrote this incredibly thoughtful letter to me. And I posted it here. And it was very meaningful to me because I think that there was a mourning process of having to let go of the residual hearing that I had to get cochlear implanted, and this weird feeling of like having to apologize to my ears for, knowing that they did the best that they could. We all have sort of our own, I think, moments or experiences where we're trying to relate to ourselves and our bodies, even when we're in a position of loss, of losing, right? Next slide. So here are some photos of me after my surgeries, and I like to call these my online dating photos, but that's because I haven't come up with a better joke for these photos. So if you have any ideas, I'd love to hear them. Here's me recovering from cochlear implant surgery a couple times, blackmail photos. Quite a look. Next slide, please. Now, the volume on this, because it was done on an iPhone, is very low. So please know that it's not your hearing aid. You don't need to call your audiologist. It's really this video. And I'm sorry for that, but we did caption it. This was when I was turned on for the very first time with my right ear. There's something that many of us talk about sometimes, this idea of what's called inspiration porn. And I know it's a very provocative term, But what inspiration porn is, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is when you see a video on social media or on the internet where you see someone who's cochlear implant and they're turned on for the first time and their eyes light up, or a baby's face lights up, and then the video stops and people think, oh, that is so touching. What a wonderful video to have watched. I'm so glad to have seen this and been a part of it. And yet it is absolutely nothing like that. It is a lot of grit. It's a lot of listening therapy. I think that my stepmother probably read to me, I can't tell you how many trash magazines and whatever else. I listened to audiobooks and read them at the same time. It's a lot of listening therapy. But this is me being turned on for the first time.
Can you hear me? You're quiet? Yeah. Okay.
It's still,
It's noisy.
that's, yeah,
Okay.
that's not my,
That's your voice. Yeah.
what?
Talk. Hello. Ba 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 ba. What are you doing? Are you okay?
So this was the next day.
Ginger. Children. 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 Sign. Children.
Sounds like ginger ale.
What about a sign?
She doesn't see your hand, it's below her.
Can you see? Children. Can you see my hand?
Just
Children.
fingers.
Children.
Children.
Yeah. You know.
Sentences are easier than words, as we all know, because you have context.
What time is it?
What time is it?
Let's go outside.
Let's go outside.
Eat your dinner.
Eat your dinner.
What do you like to eat?
What do you like to eat? Ba 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 ba. Oh, I forgot what this feels like. It's so weird.
Can you hear me on that side? Is it loud? Is it soft?
No, it's soft.
Okay. Term.
Term.
Deep.
Deep.
Vowel.
Vowel.
Guess.
Guess.
Fair.
Fair.
Which.
Which.
So I want to tell you that each time they tested me or they were doing the words, it was with that dreaded, I mean, can you imagine? She was holding that, black screen in front of her mouth. And for those of us with hearing loss, there is probably no bigger nightmare than having someone cover their mouth when they're talking, right? But so in the first video, she signed children, but remember I have the vision loss, so she was doing it down here and I couldn't see her hands. Here's what I'll tell you. On that last one, I wanted to show you 10 months later because I killed it. And I wanted to show off. So thank you for letting me do that. I will tell you there was a tremendous amount of work. It is, for me at least, and there's nothing I love more than having my cochlear implants off. Having said that, getting cochlear implanted and relearning how to hear digitally is just, at least for me, has been just shy of miraculous in terms of being able to have that information restored. And as soon as I became a candidate, I got implanted. I didn't wait. I know that a lot of people contemplate. When you have a condition that's causing you to go blind and deaf, you don't have time. I have a tremendous sense of time and urgency. I don't spend a lot of time mulling over all of the possibilities and worrying about every case scenario. I generally tend to go for it because I know that there's no sort of better time than right now. So I did it as soon as I became a candidate, which was helpful because of my auditory reserve, that I was able to recognize sounds better. Next slide, please. Okay. So part of what I did, having a condition that causes you to go deaf and blind, and then living with chronic pain from sustaining the injuries that I sustained, means that being physically active is not only a necessity in order for me to take care of my body, but it's a tremendous way for me to feel like life is not so completely out of my control. I can't control that I'm going deaf. I can't control that I'm going blind, but I can control how I take care of myself physically. And I feel so incredibly able, and I feel so alive when I'm being physically active. So civilian military combine is a race that they do it essentially mimics what military personnel go through when they do their training. So I've done 8 of those races, and here are some photos from that just for fun. Next slide, please. So my sister and my stepmother and I summited Mount Kilimanjaro in 2015. And in July of 2015, that was quite an experience, unlike anything I could describe. It was so invigorating and scary, and there were a lot of things that happened. One of which was that as we got higher in altitude, my hearing aids started to slowly break down. Like the batteries were just my cochlear implant. I only had one cochlear implant and one hearing aid at the time. Fortunately, earlier in the hike, I was teaching one of the guides sign language, and he was teaching me Swahili. And the good news is that as we got higher in elevation, I could stop wearing my cochlear implant, and he could even sign some rudimentary sign to me, and I could practice my ridiculous Swahili with him. But it was quite an experience. And I don't know if my stepmom is still on this call, but I believe when she did it, let's see, it's 2015. I think she was 60 something. And she powerhoused her way to the top. Pretty incredible. So definitely a remarkable experience, and a lot of different sensory neural experiences along the way. Next slide, please. So later that year, I actually swam from Alcatraz to shore, and that's me with the green swim cap on and my kayaker to make sure that I didn't get completely swept away with the current. There was a shark attack 2 weeks before, and yet I still thought it was a good idea as a deafblind person to swim in the open water. And it was, again, just unlike anything I used to swim in a lake in the summers. Lake and open water ocean, 2 totally different ball games. And I didn't have my implants on. My goggles were getting foggier and foggier as we made our way in. And I could just see the kayaker vigorously throwing his hand like, we got to swim faster. And I'm thinking, it's 53 degrees in this water. I can barely breathe because of this wetsuit. And this guy is telling me to go faster. And you can imagine the expletives that were going through my mind. But it turns out that if we didn't swim faster, we would have missed the opening to Aquatic Park and been swept out into the ocean. So despite the expletives in my mind, I did swim harder and faster, and we did make it to shore. But I thought that was kind of a cool photo with the Golden Gate Bridge in the background. Next slide, please. So in 2015, I believe, I wrote a memoir. And, it's interesting. I was approached some years earlier by a literary agent. There was an article that was written called Going Deaf and Blind in the City of Noise and Lights. And he happened to read it. It was a New York magazine. And he approached me and said, would you like to write a memoir? And I'm thinking, at the time, I think I was like 28. And I was thinking, what in the world does a 28-year-old have any business doing writing a memoir? So I sort of turned him down. And some years later, we did another fundraiser event, and it was written up in the New York Times. And he approached me again and he said, now would you consider it? So I did. I wrote a memoir. And part of the reason why I did it is because in my own coming to terms with having a condition that's causing me to go deaf and blind, I found that reading other people's stories, their memoirs, and learning more about the human condition and the human spirit was immensely cathartic and helpful to me. And I also knew that there wasn't anything else out there really from someone who was going deaf and blind besides, Helen Keller. And so I wanted people to know that they weren't alone. So I wrote a book. My brother is a correspondent, a senior White House correspondent for NBC, and he had me on the Today Show to share the news when my book first came out. And that's what this photo is from. Next slide, please. So I recently sold the movie optioning rights to my book to Netflix, and it's in pre-production right now and being made into a movie. So let's see how that goes. Next slide. So this is me with Disability Rights Advocate. I'm on the board of the Disability Rights Advocates, and these are just sort of various places and people I've met along the way in hopes of developing greater awareness, advocacy, and access for people with all different types of disabilities, but particularly for people with both hearing loss and vision loss. Next slide, please. So I'm not sure whether this one is captioned. I believe that it is, but sometimes it's been a little wonky. This is, I just want to tell you, so that breathe in peace, breathe out fear that I mentioned to you some time ago, it actually happened to come in full circle because this is a Gap campaign for their Gap Fit. It was called Love Your You, and they featured me in their campaign. And at the beginning, when it starts, just in case the captioning is not working properly, I say, breathe in peace, breathe out fear. So let's see if the words are working, but it's just for the captioner, there's very little language. There's not a lot, so I'm hoping that they got it right on this one. Go ahead.
Breathe in peace, breathe out fear. There's something so incredibly empowering about accepting who you are. When we love ourselves, whatever shape we take, we can focus on what we have instead of what we don't.
So unbeknownst to me, as I was just trying to say, keep my life in order on that bike ride, it came in handy some years later. Next slide, please.
Breathe in peace, breathe out.
There we go. So in 2020, just before the world shut down, for International Women's Day, they decided to spotlight me for their International Women's Day campaign, and they made 2 t-shirts that say breathe in peace, breathe out fear. And it, I think, was like March, 9th of 2020. So you can imagine how well that took off. But that was from the International Women's Day, the Gap campaign for 2020. Next slide, please. So this is Lululemon is the name of a fitness brand, and I'm their very first, was their very first disability ambassador. I wanted to make sure in that picture that I had before with my hearing aids, I wanted to make sure that they spotlighted my cochlear implant and my hearing aids. And so in this photo in the center, you can see my cochlear implant. And in that last photo, you may not remember, they really honed in on my cochlear implant. And I really wanted us to have a photo of strength, of being sweaty, of exercising, of being able to marry disability with something other than what we may have previously connoted disability with. That you can have a disability and you can be physically active, and that you decide and determine what your life will look like and what you're capable of, not what you have seen only, historically and what society has shown you. So I really wanted to make sure that they spotlighted that I was wearing a cochlear implant, and they did. Next slide. And so these are just some of the fitness events that I've done, but also awareness events. We did an awareness event for Usher syndrome at Major League Baseball stadiums. We did Red Sox, we did Yankees, we went to Wrigley Field. We went all over to raise awareness. And this is another event we did in Los Angeles. I led a class there, and a bike ride below. That's actually Bill Cunningham, who was a very famous photojournalist who is now no longer with us, but who worked for the New York Times. And so I mostly posted that photo and put it in there so that he could be recognized. Next slide, please. And ta-da! This is me, where you can find my book. I think there's one more slide that has my social media information, but that's it. And I am open for questions.
Thank you, Rebecca. I can't tell you how inspiring and moving your talk is. I will share with you, before we turn to questions, a comment from Ruth Bernstein, who one of our board members you may know, who's saying, your courage and fortitude are a shining example to anyone with a disability. And I think one of the comments you made, that towards the end, that you can have a disability and determine what your life will be. I think that's very important, that you have recognized your limitations and your disability at the same time. You haven't given it to if people do have questions or comments, please type them into the chat box. I would also make my own comment about the implants, and it's terrific that you showed the process of mapping and getting accustomed to it. I think that those of us who have implants understand that, but many people don't understand that process. And particularly many of us have been disturbed, this past year, the movie Sound of Metal, which I don't know if you've been able to see that, which is a terrific movie in many respects, really completely misses that process. So my question for you is, you mentioned the hearing aid, you mentioned implants. What other kinds of technology to use? You're doing psychotherapy, you're doing interviews. How do you get through all of that? What do you use to allow you to do that?
Well, as soon as I don't have to listen to anyone, I take my cochlear implants off to have a breather from having to, listen, as we all do, right? We work so hard to listen. But I have a Roger pen. For those, I have Advanced Bionics, which is one of the three cochlear implant companies. There's Med-El, Cochlear, and Advanced Bionics. So they have a Roger pen. They're also umbrellaed under Phonak, for those of you who have Phonak. Some of you may have the Roger pen as well, because they use them both for hearing aids. And, since I've been home, it's been interesting, right? I mean, certainly having captioning really helps. I have found more for me that some of the visual issues dealing with all of technology has been a bit more difficult than some of the hearing issues. And I'll tell you that that's because I have worked as hard as I have on having the hearing that I have with my cochlear implants. But it's exhausting. I mean, there's no question that when I do not have to be listening to anyone, I would say that I sleep better than anybody in New York City, but unfortunately on this call, that's not true. I'm sure that we could all fight for who sleeps the best on this call, because when we have our hearing aids off or our cochlear implants off, it's quite relaxing, at least for me. So I do use a Roger pen oftentimes. It will be interesting to see what happens when we go back out into the world, because it's been a little bit different. I am not shy about saying that I have hearing loss. I'm not shy about asking people to repeat themselves. I think that there's a tremendous amount of shame that many of us have either experienced or some of us sometimes still experience. And that's something that I no longer I sort of see it as their problem and not mine. But it's a good question, because we've been sort of so much on lockdown that I've found my own sort of comfort zone at home. And so translating that when we get back out into the world will be interesting. Yeah, but the Roger pen, I definitely will use at times when I need it.
Thank you. You said something a little while ago, which is also very consistent with the HLAA message, and also that Nicole touched on before, is self-advocacy, to not be ashamed and to advocate for yourself and request the things that you need. You also touched upon, how difficult the visual issues make it for you. David Landsberg had a question. Your slides are so aesthetically pleasing. How are you able to assemble them with your vision loss? Is it that your visual acuity within the 10 degrees of visual field is good?
So my central vision is, and so let me preface this. So two things, one of which is a woman, Nancy Quarterman, who is the president and the founder of the Usher Syndrome Society. I'm on her board, and she helped me put these together, because for any of you who've ever tried to make a PowerPoint, it's so finicky. It doesn't make sense. I don't get it. Why is it so difficult just to put a stupid picture next to a stupid picture? I don't know why it's so complicated, but it's complicated. So she was very helpful with that, because I have the patience of whatever has little patience. I have that kind of patience. So I did have help, and I selected everything that I wanted to use. And then she actually visually put it together to make it aesthetically pleasing. The question was about so my central vision is quite strong. I will tell you that in the midst of this, I am in the middle of cataract surgery. So my left eye has been corrected with cataract surgery, and my right eye is not yet corrected. And the last it was May 10th, I think I had the surgery. It's been one hell of a ride for the last several weeks. And I think that my expectations were not managed properly the way that they were when I got cochlear implanted. When I was cochlear implanted, I was told, you're gonna wonder, what the heck did I do? I can't believe I did this. Whatever it was. And you can see in that video when I was turned on or activated the first time, that was exactly what I felt. What the actual expletive have I done? And I think with cataract surgery, we hear about people, at least I did, who don't have vision impairments, and they say, yeah, I got my cataracts done, and the next day I was on my computer and everything was so bright and beautiful. And so I thought, okay, great. Well, unfortunately, there are a lot of other aspects to having cataract surgery, not just for people with vision loss, but so I've been in this interim state where I've actually felt more blind lately than before. And that's been scary, right? Because it's sort of been having to face one of my biggest challenges and fears, and that is of being blind and not being able to navigate. Now I'm doing a lot of different types of training, and I've started to learn Braille. It's very, very difficult, but it's something that I know that I need to continue working towards. But it's a good question that you ask. So I am sitting at a certain distance from my computer, because we're talking about 10 degrees. You think of it in terms of like a camera lens. So the closer someone is, actually, the more difficult it can be. Sometimes the further they are, the more I actually can see of their face and the environment around them. I don't know if I answered your question.
So Al Chen said, awesome presentation, Rebecca. Question, how does one go about becoming a disability rights advocate?
So I think there are so many ways in which we can be advocates. We can advocate for ourselves. We can advocate for other people. I think that leading by example is really important. I think that starting locally, starting with yourself, is the most important place to start. So if you are not yet, if you have some reservations about certain types of advocacy or advocating for yourself, anytime I have discomfort with something, for instance, using my cane, that was a direct flag to me that said, this is something you need to develop more comfort with. Oftentimes when we are faced with something that feels unfamiliar or uncomfortable, our instinct is to shut it down, to turn it away. I don't want to deal with it. No, thank you. When you ask someone about something and it really touches something inside of them, they may say like, yeah, it's fine. It's fine. I got it. It's fine. Yeah, I don't want to talk about it, whatever. So you know that you've struck a chord, right? And I think that we often feel that way in our own lives. So for me, when I have found discomfort in things, I've decided that I need to lean into it a little bit more, like using my cane more actively and in public places. So in terms of doing advocacy work, there are a lot of organizations. I think sometimes we feel like, well, I want to become an advocate. And we think that we have to reinvent the wheel. there are so many organizations out there that need your help and your support. And it could be HLAA, it could be disability rights advocates. There are so many different, I'm on the board of the No Limits for Deaf Children. They're in California, but there's so many different organizations that are looking to have people help with advocacy. So I certainly encourage you to see what's out there, but the best place to start is with yourself and to help teach other people what has been most useful to you, I think, in your own work of self-advocacy and helping them advocate for themselves.
Wow. Your passion for all of this is inspiring. Tony Acolucci said, "You've accomplished enough for 3 lives, but is there anything else that you still dream about doing?"
Oh man, yeah, of course. I would love to. I would love to learn Braille and have it not be such a difficult endeavor. But I'd really love to go to India, which I don't know when that will happen, given where we are. But mostly because I spent some time in Thailand volunteering there with the elephants. I love elephants. I've always loved elephants because they're so huge. Maybe it's sort of the whole elephant in the room idea. But it was such an incredible experience for me. Maybe it's a slide I need to put in my slideshow at some point. But I spent quite a bit of time with the elephants in Thailand, and I would love to spend some time with elephants in India as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Are there more questions from anybody, more comments? Okay, well, this was just a fabulous presentation, and I read your book a couple of years ago. I would encourage anybody here who would be interested to read the book. A lot of what you've said tonight is included in the book, but there's lots more too. And it's a wonderful book. Oh, okay. Well, there's a question here from Jerry Bergman, but yeah, he was a little bit late, doesn't he? He said to ask you about the time you drove up and parked your car and got out with your blindness cane, but you actually did talk about that already. Here's another question. Is the auditory training for the second CI as long and hard as the first CI?
No. I did not find that it was as long as hard. In fact, my right ear, after I was implanted and went through all of the listening therapy, I think a year later I tested. So remember, that was the 28 to 26% in a sound booth. And remember, we will always do better with sentences because we have context. I tested somewhere between about 92 and 98%. Now my left ear, because I got implanted as soon as it became a candidate, 3 months, sentences in a quiet room, so ideal environment, right? My hearing tested at 100%. And that was, you can imagine how much I cried when that happened because of how much I was really sort of missing and sort of suffering before I had the surgery. So yeah, it was dramatic, and everybody's results are going to be different based on so many different factors. But the left ear, I did not do as much work for. It sort of picked up a lot faster. So I found that getting the second ear was, it was a bit less sort of dramatic than getting the first ear, but I had more of that surround sound. Yeah.
Do you think there was a big difference in the hardware between the 2 implants, that things had improved, or?
So here's what's interesting. Sure. So my left ear turns on faster than my right ear. My right ear takes about 10 seconds. The fact that we know this is ridiculous, right? So it takes about 10 seconds. My left ear, I think, is somewhere in that 5 something range. But what I find is that the electrodes that were put into my left ear were not as damaging to the hair cells. So I still have those low frequencies in that ear. But I got to tell you, people say, well, if I had $1 for every time somebody with hearing loss told me that they're waiting for stem cell research or that they're waiting for technology to improve with cochlear implants, I would be a very rich woman. What I can tell you is that waiting will do you no good, because you have to live now, and you have to do the best that you can for yourself now. And this is the best thing I could have done for myself, no matter how much technology will continue to advance. And I will tell you that the internal piece does not need to be upgraded when the external piece is upgraded. So that's important. You don't have to go back in there and do the whole song and dance again.
Thank you. The next question is, what are your thoughts on using a guide dog now or in the future?
I will absolutely use a guide dog when it's my time. My biggest issue is making sure that I keep that guide dog trained, because what I didn't mention somehow on this call is that there is nothing I love more than dogs. Dogs are my pride and joy. They make me very, very happy. So sometimes my dog is hanging in the back, but she's not there right now. So I definitely will get a guide dog when that time comes.
Thank you. Any other questions for Rebecca? Well, this has just been terrific. I think everybody, I'm sure, is as thrilled with it as I am. So thank you for this. I would also like to again congratulate Nicole. You look like you're waiting to say something. Were you waiting to say something? Okay. I'd like to again congratulate Nicole, to wish her well, and look forward to hearing about her progress at Hunter. And thanks to Rebecca for this presentation. Thank you also to board member David Landsberger for being our host, our Zoom host, and to our star captioner, Lauren Schechter. We've all been to many meetings on Zoom this year, and many of them in caption, but none of the captioning is as good as what Lauren gives us.
Mm-hmm.
I see that there's a question. There's a question from Catherine about. Oh, could you talk about your? Sorry to go back. Can you talk about your psychotherapy practice a bit? Do you specialize in people with disabilities? Were you doing therapy before you got the implants, and how did you manage that?
Yes, I was doing therapy before I got implanted. And so I would oftentimes have people either wear the Roger pen, or I would put it on the seat chair, like the armrest next to them. I oftentimes had patients who would come in and, when they're talking about things that they feel either shame around or vulnerable about, they will speak very quietly. And we can all imagine what that's like, to be in a room with someone and you can't hear them and you're supposed to be helping them. So I had various conversations of having to say, listen, I want to be able to help you, but I have hearing loss. So unless you speak up, I know how difficult it is to say some of these things out loud and to hear yourself say them and to have someone else hear you say them. But if you don't speak up, I won't be able to support you, to help you. I also told someone who struggled with it, I told her that unless she wanted me to sit on her lap, that we were not going to be able to make progress because she spoke so softly. So there were a couple people I terminated with because I simply felt like I wasn't able to help them because of my hearing loss at the time. Now, this was before I was cochlear implanted, but I still, there's still air conditioning, and air conditioning is so stinking loud. I don't know why, but for those of us with hearing loss, we know what that sounds like when it's blasting into your ear and you're trying to hear. I do have some part of my population that I work with have hearing loss. I have fewer people with vision loss, which is sort of, I think, interesting. And I think that there's a lot that people feel there's in the vision loss and the hearing loss community. That's a whole other presentation. But I do find that people with hearing loss tend to find me. I use sign language with probably about 4 of my patients. So that keeps me on my feet. But so, yeah, I volunteered for Governor Cuomo at the beginning of the pandemic, and I was working with frontline workers. So basically medical professionals this was in March and April of last year. And I didn't realize how much of the sort of secondary trauma I experienced just in working with them because of some of the really traumatic and difficult things that they went through and that I had to work with them through. So that's something I'm now sort of having to reconcile with, of understanding the fears that I have that were developed from, I think, that time. And so I definitely feel like I've worked through that. But being a psychotherapist and having to hear for a living is kind of ironic when you have hearing loss, isn't it? but it really, really, highlights and underlines the importance of being a self-advocate, of advocating for yourself and what you need.
Well, the questions keep coming in. What can people do to communicate with someone with a vision loss in a crowded room? I have a vision loss and cannot always see who is talking to me.
So what I usually do when I get on a call is I will say two things. One of which is when I have a presentation, and particularly for people who do have vision loss, I will say, "Hi, this is Rebecca speaking." So that before anybody talks, when you approach someone with vision loss, it's always important to identify yourself. Sometimes people with vision loss actually can't tell that it's you until you actually say, "This is Catherine." And I say, "Oh, hi, Catherine." And then all of a sudden she tells me it's Catherine, and my brain and my sight put it together, right? But some people can't see that. And if it's dark, you certainly, how many times I've been introduced to somebody and I said, "Oh, Alan, it's so nice to meet you." And they say, "He's on your left." "It's so nice to meet you." So it's a lot of it. You do have to have a sense of humor. I think all of us on this call know that living with hearing loss, living with any disability adversity requires a wicked sense of humor. But when I give presentations, I say, I'm Rebecca Alexander. I'm a white woman with long, dark brown hair. I'm wearing a green sleeveless top. Behind me are fake flowers that I found in the apartment and threw together to make it look nice. And over my right shoulder is a dark blue, chair with a lamp next to it. Giving environmental information can be very, very important. And so I oftentimes encourage people, it's difficult. We're coming out of COVID, right? Where we're not able to touch anyone and we're scared of what we're not sure what they feel comfortable with. And so I often say, I'm going to lead your hand to your drink. If it's a friend of mine who's blind and they're looking for their drink, instead of taking on the possibility that they're spilled their wine across the entire table, I orient them. And I oftentimes will use, for instance, the clock, reference of your plate is at 12 o'clock, your wine is at 2 o'clock, and I'll bring their hand. "Do you mind if I bring your hand to show you where it is?" So that they're oriented. Because when you can't see, it's a bit disorienting. So to have that tactile ability to orient yourself is very important. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. There are two more questions in the chat, and I think we'll have to make these the last two. Our group knows the hard of hearing community well. In what ways is it similar, and what ways is it different from the vision impaired community?
Sure. So, vision loss it's interesting because historically, when we think of the deaf community, we think, "Oh, okay, well, they get deaf blindness. They're deaf. They know what it's like to have a disability and use sign language." But in fact, when you're culturally deaf, using your hands, that's your voice, right? So when you have a deaf blind person who needs to hold your hand, it almost feels like someone's holding your, a hand over your mouth, right? So I have found that both the sighted and the deaf have sort of had this interesting struggle of trying to make sense of how to help someone with both vision and hearing loss. The difference is that it's different when you're born with hearing loss, when you're born with blindness or low vision, than when you progressively become someone with hearing loss or someone with low vision. It's a very different experience. I will tell you that learning the orientation and mobility that you learn with vision loss is much different than you learn with hearing loss. And the deaf blind community is a whole other, it's a whole other spectrum of this. So the difference I have found is that people are much more willing to reach out with hearing loss for therapy and not as much for vision loss. As much as we experience people with shame around hearing loss and hiding their hearing aids, I have seen far more people not reach out and live with this sense of shame of not being able to see, and therefore not using their cane and putting themselves in vulnerable and precarious positions. There are a lot of people who think that using a cane makes them more vulnerable. And instead of, really seeing it as, I first started using my cane, so that when I first started using my cane, it was like Moses parting the waters. Everybody would get out of my way. And I was like, well, this is great, right? Especially in New York City. And then I started to realize that the information I was getting from the tip of my cane was far more useful and beneficial to me than any technology that had been developed through, any Google glasses or any apps. So I don't think that I'm really answering your question, but it is quite a different experience. Hearing loss and vision loss in some ways are similar, but even going through this cataract situation has been very different than what I went through with my cochlear implants.
Okay, and the last question is, do you feel your vision loss is steady, long-term, or progressively getting worse?
Well, I would say, I don't like to sort of say, yeah, it's progressively getting worse, but signs are not pointing exactly in an upward trajectory. So what I know and what I can only pass on to you is that whatever it is that you're thinking about doing, whatever it is that you're mulling over, know that when you live with vision and hearing loss and progressive vision and hearing loss, and I've mentioned this before, I am keenly aware of time, and I am keenly aware of not wasting time. So I want to encourage all of you to think about the ways in which you might waste time, or the people you might waste time on or with, and think about ways in which you can streamline your life a bit more so that you don't have to add any extra chaos or unnecessary burden to yourself and to your life. And to pursue the things that you may feel uncertain about, I want to really encourage you to know that you're not alone, that there's so many of us out here who are just doing the best we can and facing our fears, no matter how difficult and scary it seems. And I also want to tell you that it's okay to cry. I cry all the time. Very cathartic, and it helps me in crying and experiencing my emotions that come with loss. It allows me to experience all of the emotions of being present, of being alive, of even feeling a sense of satisfaction and, dare I say, happiness.
Thank you. But before we close this out, Nicole, our scholarship winner, has asked to make a final comment to you, Rebecca. So Nicole, you can unmute.
Yes, Rebecca, you're such a strong and inspiring person. I'm so happy that I got this opportunity to meet you, and how you talked about, it's okay to have emotion. Because when I was writing my essay, every time I write about my hearing loss, I just start tearing up. And it's I'm telling myself, why are you getting emotional? But I just let myself cry, I guess. And a lot of the things we talked about overlap, and it really shows that all of us, we have similar struggles to an extent. And I love how there's a whole community here. And I've never felt a part of, a hearing loss community. I've never been part of it. And so being here really allowed me to feel that. And I'm also happy that you mentioned India, because I'm actually Indian myself. And I know you would love it there because there's a lot of colors and sounds, and it's very overwhelming, but I know you would. It's definitely worth it. So you would enjoy it.
Nicole, at some point, because I live not far from Hunter, we have to go to this Indian restaurant. It is so delicious, called Drunken Monkey. I went there last weekend and it is so delicious.
I'm down.
I can't even
Yes,
handle it.
I'm down to go with you. We have to.
I would love that.
Well, thank you for that comment, Nicole. And we're glad to welcome you to this hearing loss community. And we would love to have more young people, so tell all your friends about us.
Yeah, I will.
We do see new faces tonight. We continue to see new faces at our meetings. To learn more about HLAA, to join, or to donate to help us continue our activities, please go to the chapter website, hearinglossnyc.org. I would like to mention a new documentary film, The Biggest Obstacle, which focuses on the problems that impact people with disabilities throughout New York City's public transit system. The feature-length film details Jessica Murray's advocacy activities to make the system more accessible. Jessica will be our featured speaker at our next meeting, which is in September, and on September 21st. For those interested, I've put the information in the chat box. There will be a sneak preview of the film Friday, June 4th at 7:30 via Google Meet, followed by Q&A. In addition, the film will also be shown with open captions twice in movie theaters, and I've posted the names and links for those movie theaters if you want to buy tickets. So with that, we will say good night. We hope that you all have a wonderful summer. And we look forward to seeing you all in the fall. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks to, again, to
Bye,
Rebecca,
have a good
to
night.
Lauren, to David, to Nicole, to Al for his generosity. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, David.
Bye.